When Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the world not only witnessed the beginning of the Pacific War, but also the debut of a war machine that would redefine aerial combat. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero. This Japanese naval fighter was not merely an aircraft. It was a technological statement and a symbol of imperial power. American pilots, overwhelmed by the surprise of the attack, would soon discover that the Zero was a lethal adversary in the skies. The Zero was, in many respects, the most advanced aircraft of its time. Designed to operate from aircraft carriers, its greatest virtues were its astonishing maneuverability and its exceptional range. Japanese engineers had sacrificed almost everything for the sake of these qualities. With no armor for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, not even a robust airframe, the Zero was incredibly light and agile. It could turn tighter than any Allied fighter of the early war, climb at an impressive rate, and stay in the air for hours, outperforming its American counterparts, the F4F Wildcat and the P-40 Warhawk, in almost every acrobatic aspect. For American pilots, the first encounters with the Zero were demoralizing. Their own fighters, designed with robustness and survivability in mind, armor-protected fuel tanks, were slower, less maneuverable, and had a lower rate of climb. Traditional air combat tactics, close-in dogfights, turns, and pursuits were suicide against the Zero. The Japanese pilots, with considerable experience accumulated in China, were skilled and aggressive, and their confidence in their machine's superiority was absolute. The situation was critical. By early 1942, the morale of Allied pilots was in decline. The Zero's technical superiority was not a myth. It was a harsh reality that exacted a heavy price in lives and machines. American pilots found themselves at a crossroads: either find a way to neutralize the Zero, or Japanese air supremacy over the Pacific would be total, making any Allied naval offensive a perilously dangerous undertaking. The American dilemma: how to fight a ghost. The dilemma was twofold. American fighters were inferior in maneuverability, and the pilots lacked the combat experience that the Japanese had accumulated. The F4F Wildcats, the backbone of U.S. naval aviation at the time, were slow and heavy. Their armor and ability to withstand damage were superior, yes, but they could not escape the Zero in a tight turn, nor could they pursue it in a climb. Every prolonged dogfight was a death sentence. The frustration among American pilots was palpable. They felt as if they were fighting a ghost, a machine that could appear, attack, and disappear at will. Planning meetings were tense. New tactics were needed, a radically different approach to exploit the few advantages that American fighters possessed. They had to think outside the box, outside the traditional combat manuals. It was in this atmosphere of desperation and forced ingenuity that the seed of a new tactic began to germinate. American pilots knew they couldn't turn with the Zero, but their fighters were faster in a dive and could absorb much more punishment. They needed a way to turn the Zero's weakness, its fragility, into its own undoing, and to do it in a way that Japanese pilots simply could not anticipate. The man behind the trap, Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thach. In the midst of this desperate search for solutions, the figure of Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thach emerged. Thach was the commander of Fighting Squadron 3, VF-3, aboard the aircraft carrier USS Yorktown, a unit that would be key in the Battle of Midway. Thach was not just an exceptional pilot. He was a thinker, a theorist of aerial combat. He dedicated hours to studying the Zero's performance, analyzing every combat report, and examining every detail of what made the Japanese planes so lethal. He knew that the key was not to try to outperform the Zero at what it did well, but to force it into a game where its own weaknesses would become fatal. In his stateroom on the carrier, or sketching with pencil and paper on the flight deck, Thach began to experiment with formations and flight patterns. His goal was simple yet revolutionary: How could an F4F Wildcat, inferior in a one-on-one fight, leverage the advantages of a second F4F Wildcat to create a deadly trap? The answer lay not in individual agility, but in the coordination of the pair. Thach understood that a single Zero could easily dispose of a Wildcat if it pursued it in a turn. But what if the Wildcat being pursued could suddenly become the bait in a trap for a second Wildcat? What if two aircraft, flying in a specific way, could protect each other and present a fatal field of fire to the approaching Zero, tricking it into a vulnerable position? Thus, in early 1942, the idea of the Thach Weave was born. It was a tactic that required discipline, training, and a perfect mutual understanding between pilots. The Japanese, confident in the individual superiority of their Zero, would never expect such a sophisticated trick of cooperation. They were about to learn that technology was not everything, and that ingenuity could be a far more potent weapon than maneuverability. The challenge facing Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thach in early 1942 was not technical, but geometric. He recognized that the Mitsubishi A6M Zero was dominant in a traditional turning dogfight, a single-plane engagement. The solution, he theorized, lay in transforming the battle from a one-on-one duel into a two-on-one ambush. Using aircraft geometry to create mutual protection, Thach, utilizing the simplest of tools, cigar smoke trails in his squadron ready room, and later matchsticks on a tabletop, developed the formation. The core principle was based on two aircraft flying in close, staggered formation, known as a finger four, later simplified to a two-plane element. This element or section would fly abreast, separated by about 150 to 200 feet. The formation was simple, but its maneuver was lethal. When a Japanese Zero committed to the attack, focusing on one American fighter, the bait, the two U.S. planes would execute the weave. The mechanics of the Thach Weave were as follows. The two U.S. fighters, Pilot 1 and Pilot 2, would be flying parallel. As the Zero began its pursuit, Pilot 1, the bait, would turn sharply inward, crossing the path of Pilot 2 simultaneously. Pilot 2, the guard, would also turn sharply inward, crossing behind Pilot 1. Crucially, as the two American planes crossed, they maintained the same relative distance. The pursuing Zero, following the turn of its target, Pilot 1, was now on a collision course, not with its original quarry, but with the crossing aircraft, Pilot 2, which was heading straight toward it. Because the Zero pilot was focused on his target's tail, he was suddenly presented with an entirely new, uncomfortably close aircraft flying across his path. If the Zero pilot instinctively broke off the attack, he would lose his advantage. If he maintained his pursuit, he would fly directly into the sights of Pilot 2, whose guns were perfectly aligned for a head-on or near head-on shot. The Zero, lacking armor, was exceptionally vulnerable to this burst of fire. The tables had been turned. The hunter was now the hunted, forced into the exact firing position the Americans desired, training the unconventional, introducing this radical, counterintuitive maneuver to the pilots of Fighting Squadron 3, VF3, based on the USS Yorktown, was a challenge. Pilots were traditionally trained to avoid crossing flight paths, and the maneuver required absolute faith in one's wingman. An error in timing meant a catastrophic mid-air collision. Thach, however, was a relentless drill master. He took his men up, flying above them, forcing them to execute the maneuver again and again. He used his own voice, crisp and demanding, over the radio to coordinate the turns. "Break! Break now!" was the constant cry, training his pilots to react as a single organism, rather than individual duelists. Thach later recalled the moment of realization. It was like trying to teach someone to throw a ball with the opposite hand. But once they got it, they realized they had the answer to the Zero. The pilots of VF3 learned not only to fly the weave, but to anticipate the exact moment the Japanese pilot would commit, ensuring their trap was sprung perfectly. The baptism of fire, The Battle of Midway, June 4, 1942. The new tactic remained untested in actual combat until the pivotal Battle of Midway. This encounter was the true crucible for the Thach Weave and the men who flew it. On June 4, 1942, a flight of 6 F4F Wildcats from the Yorktown, led by Thach himself, was providing cover for the sinking tanker USS Neosho when they were jumped by a far superior force of Zeros. The Japanese pilots, confident in their machine's agility, immediately pressed the attack, seeking the classic tail chase. What happened next was a bewildering shock to the Japanese pilots. As the Zeros closed in, the American Wildcats, instead of running or trying to turn away, executed the weave. The Japanese leader, fixated on his target, suddenly saw a second Wildcat, guns blazing, fly directly across his nose. He had flown right into the ambush. Thach's own testimony from the battle is vivid. "We caught him. He got a burst right down the middle, and the Zero just disintegrated." They couldn't believe it. They'd never seen anything like it. The engagement was a profound success. In the ensuing chaotic brawl, the 6 Wildcats fought the estimated dozen or more Zeros to a standstill, with the Zeros failing to score a single kill on the American section. The American pilots claimed several Zeros downed, proving the devastating effectiveness of the cooperative defense. The impact was immediate and tactical. The Thach Weave stripped the Zero of its primary advantage, its superior turning radius. The Japanese pilots, who had never trained for or anticipated a cooperative defense maneuver, were consistently caught off guard. They had been taught to trust their machine's individual superiority. They were undone by American ingenuity and teamwork. The Japanese pilots never expected this kind of sophisticated defensive counter-tactic, and it was a strategic shock that began to erode their dominance in the Pacific Air War. The success of the Thach Weave at Midway was a watershed moment, immediately recognized by U.S. Navy Command as the crucial tactical breakthrough they had desperately needed. Reports from the surviving pilots of VF-3, particularly those of Lieutenant Commander Thach, were distributed urgently across the entire U.S. Navy and Marine Corps aviation units fighting in the Pacific. The days of fighting the Zero in single-plane, turning duels were over. The swift adoption of the Thach Weave revolutionized U.S. naval air combat doctrine. The fundamental fighting element changed from the 3- or 4-plane section, which often devolved into individual fights, to the 2-plane element, pilot and wingman, flying in tight, disciplined coordination. The wingman was no longer just a lookout. He was an integral part of the offensive and defensive geometry. Pilots were aggressively retrained. They were taught to trust the sturdy construction of their F4F Wildcat and to rely on the weave whenever a Zero got on their tail. The American advantage was now predicated on a clear understanding of the aircraft's respective strengths and weaknesses. U.S. advantage: speed in a dive, superior armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and the collective defense of the Weave. Japanese weakness: extreme fragility, lack of pilot protection, and a tactical doctrine focused almost entirely on the individual pilot's dogfighting skill. The result was a dramatic shift in the kill-to-loss ratio. Where the Zero had once dominated, achieving scores of 6.1 or 8.1 in early engagements, the new tactics rapidly equalized the fight. The Americans were now surviving Zero attacks, and the Zeros were flying directly into fatal traps. The Guadalcanal Crucible, the pivotal Battle of Guadalcanal, August 1942, February 1943, became the proving ground where the Thach Weave cemented American air superiority. Marine Corps pilots, flying the Wildcat from the precarious Henderson Field, were under constant pressure from elite Japanese naval aviators, flying out of Rabaul. Pilots like Major John L. Smith and Captain Joe Foss, the Marine Corps' first ace, relied religiously on the 2-plane element and the weave. They executed the maneuver countless times over the bloody skies of the island, catching Zero after Zero. The American pilots realized the Japanese confidence was their downfall. The Zero pilots were so sure of their turning superiority that they pressed the attack too closely, always falling victim to the counter-turning trap. Joe Foss later remarked on the devastating effectiveness. It was a beautiful thing. They would come right in on the tail of your wingman, and you'd cross, and he was suddenly right in front of your guns. The Japanese never seemed to figure out what was happening. The Japanese response, bewilderment and denial for the Japanese high command, the sudden sharp increase in losses, and the failure of the Zero pilots to achieve kills was mystifying. They struggled to understand why their superior fighter was suddenly vulnerable. The most senior Japanese pilots and commanders were slow to adapt. They initially dismissed the U.S. success as luck or attributed it to a sudden surge in the number of American planes. The deep-rooted Japanese philosophy emphasized the pilot's individual skill and the inherent superiority of the Zero's design. To acknowledge that a simple cooperative tactic could neutralize their technological edge was a blow to their entire aerial doctrine. Crucially, Japanese pilot training lacked emphasis on teamwork and mutual defense. Training focused on aggressive maneuvers and individual glory, making a disciplined counter-tactic like the Weave almost impossible for them to implement quickly. Furthermore, the intense attrition rate of elite Japanese pilots in the long, arduous battles of the Pacific meant that the core of their experienced aviators, the ones who might have adapted, were steadily wiped out. They simply did not have the time or the institutional flexibility to teach a sophisticated defensive trap. By late 1942, the Zero had been effectively dethroned, not by a superior aircraft design, but by a superior idea. The Thach Weave allowed the rugged American fighters to survive the crucial gap in time, until superior U.S. aircraft like the Grumman F4F Wildcat and the Vought F4U Corsair arrived. These new fighters, faster and more powerful, retained the protective armor and self-sealing fuel tanks of their predecessors. And now they were flown by pilots, rigorously trained in the cooperative tactics of the Weave. The Japanese never truly recovered from the tactical shock of the Thach Weave. It was the ingenious ambush that broke the spirit of the Zero and paved the way for the ultimate American air dominance in the Pacific. The invention of the Thach Weave transcended its immediate purpose of saving the F4F Wildcat from the Zero. It proved, definitively, that in air combat, the calculus of victory is determined not only by thrust and wing loading, but by teamwork and tactical foresight. It was a victory of the mind over metal, of ingenuity over mere agility, the tactical revolution beyond the Pacific. By the time the new generation of American naval fighters, the F4F Wildcat and the F4U Corsair, entered widespread service in 1943, the tide of the Pacific Air War had turned irrevocably. These planes were faster than the Zero, more robust, and boasted superior diving performance. They were, in short, technically superior. Crucially, they were flown by pilots for whom the Thach Weave was not a novel, desperate trick, but a fundamental element of their training. The legacy of the Weave allowed these new fighters to fully exploit their speed advantage. Pilots were taught to use boom and zoom tactics, diving from altitude, firing, and using their speed to climb away, and to rely on the Weave if a Zero managed to successfully engage them in a turn. The combination of superior aircraft and superior teamwork created an overwhelming advantage that Japanese aviation never managed to overcome. The Japanese, having failed to adapt their training doctrines, continued to rely on the superior turning capability of the Zero. Their best pilots were being lost at an accelerating rate, and without the experienced instructors to pass on any new wisdom, their air corps withered, the architect's lasting influence, the man behind the revolution. John S. Jimmy Thach continued his distinguished career, eventually rising to the rank of admiral. His contribution was not just a wartime fix. It fundamentally altered how air forces around the globe thought about fighter tactics. The core concept of the weave, mutual support, using geometry to turn a defensive maneuver into an offensive threat, became an essential foundation of modern air combat. The fundamental unit of the two-plane element remains the bedrock of modern military aviation, from the Korean War to contemporary operations. Whenever a modern fighter jet pilot, flying an F-22 Raptor or an FA-18 Super Hornet, calls out a maneuver to his wingman for mutual protection, he is executing a doctrinal descendant of the Thach Weave. The maneuver proved that an aircraft with perceived technical inferiority could achieve parity or even superiority against a technically stronger foe through tactical genius. It stripped away the psychological advantage the Japanese had enjoyed, replacing American despair with confidence, the finality of the trap. The Thach Weave stands as the definitive answer to the video's core question. The Japanese never expected this trap from US fighters. They were psychologically and doctrinally unprepared for the American shift from individual heroics to disciplined cooperative defense. Their initial technological lead, the agility of the Zero, was neutralized by an idea born from necessity in a cramped carrier-ready room. The Japanese had trained for the dance of the individual duel. The Americans, led by Thach, countered with the geometry of the team ambush. In the end, the Thach Weave was more than a tactic. It was the mechanism of survival for a generation of American naval aviators, and the strategic tool that allowed the US to seize and maintain the command of the skies over the Pacific. It proved that in war, the sharpest weapon is often not the latest engine or the thickest armor, but the coordinated ingenuity of the human mind. The strategic impact of the Thach Weave did not conclude with the Japanese surrender in 1945. Rather, it merely shifted theaters, transitioning seamlessly into the jet age and the complexities of the Cold War. The core lesson learned by the U.S. Navy, that cooperative tactics could overcome design deficiencies, was rigorously applied to the development of subsequent fighter aircraft. The true test of the Weave's enduring relevance came during the Korean War, 1950–1953. Here, the American F-86 Sabre faced the Soviet-designed MiG-15. The two jets were closely matched, but the MiG-15 possessed a significant advantage in climb rate and high-altitude performance. Pilots once again faced a superior turning and climbing foe, reminiscent of the Zero Wildcat mismatch. The U.S. response was immediate. Pilots flying the Sabre rigorously utilized a modernized version of the Thach Weave, flying in tight, disciplined pairs. The Fluid II formation, as it became known, maintained the principles of mutual support and crossing, and paths to ensure the wingman was always positioned to protect his leader or shoot down the pursuing MiG. The result in MiG Alley, the infamous air corridor along the Yalu River, was staggering. American F-86 pilots, despite often being outnumbered and facing a technically superior climber, achieved a kill ratio of roughly 10.1 against their opponents. This incredible statistical dominance was, by the admission of air strategists, a direct legacy of the tactical genius forged by Jimmy Thach in the desperate days of the Pacific. The lessons of Guadalcanal were saving pilots' lives over Korea. The Thach Weave fundamentally changed the culture of the American military pilot. It instilled the absolute, non-negotiable principle of the wingman concept. No longer was the wingman a less experienced pilot flying loosely alongside an ace. He was an equal partner, and a failure to protect the element was considered the gravest error. This partnership fostered a collective strength that defined U.S. aerial operations. The Japanese pilots, whose cultural and doctrinal training emphasized individual martial skill, bushido, and single-plane maneuverability, were unable to institutionalize the necessary teamwork. Their failure to adapt to the Weave cost them not just the air war, but the very core of their most valuable resource, their elite pilot corps. In contrast, the American emphasis on the team, validated by the astounding success of the Weave, allowed the U.S. to rapidly train and integrate new pilots into combat, maintaining a consistent level of tactical proficiency that the Japanese could never match. The Weave became the ultimate expression of American pragmatism in war. Ingenuity and teamwork will always defeat individual brilliance in the long run. The story of the Thach Weave is thus a tribute to tactical innovation born under pressure. It is a reminder that the most lethal weapon in war is not a secret engine or a new gun, but a superior idea executed with iron discipline. The Japanese flew the most agile fighter of its time, but they never expected that their opponents, flying seemingly inferior aircraft, would have the wit to use simple geometry and teamwork to turn their advantage into a coffin. The trap laid by John S. Jimmy Thach was the ultimate ambush, a brilliant life-saving legacy that continues to define the geometry of every modern aerial engagement.